think for a second about the air you just breathed in. That invisible mix, it's about 21% oxygen, right? The very fuel our bodies run on.
Exactly.
Now imagine taking that oxygen level all the way to 100% and then squeezing that air, increasing the pressure way beyond what we normally experience.
Yeah, that's hyperbaric oxygenation, HBO.
And that's the fascinating world we're diving into today.
Precisely. And in this deep dive, we're not just, skimming the surface. We're plunging right into the scientific text to understand exactly what this supercharged oxygen environment does to a healthy human body.
Okay.
So, consider this our foundational exploration. It's the essential groundwork before we even touch on how HBO might be used therapeutically. That's a topic our source suggests we can explore another time.
Gotcha. Okay, so the mission is clear. How does HBO fundamentally change the way our bodies work when we're otherwise healthy? Let's get a sense of the journey we're about to take.
All right. We'll kick off with the basic physics. The rules governing how gases behave under pressure. These are the rules HBO plays by.
Makes sense.
Then we'll quickly revisit how oxygen normally moves through our system, just to establish our baseline.
Okay.
And finally, we'll dive deep into the specific effects of that increased oxygen pressure on, pretty much everything from our major organ systems right down to the intricate molecular level.
Right, because this isn't just about getting more oxygen molecules in. It's really about how pressure changes the game, how it amplifies oxygen's power, and the surprising ripple effects that has throughout our incredibly complex biology. Okay, where do we begin?
Let's start with those fundamental physical principles. So the air around us exerts pressure, right? And Dalton's law tells us that the total pressure of a gas mixture, like air, is simply the sum of the pressures of each individual gas in it.
Okay.
At sea level, that total is around 760 millimeters of mercury, mmHg. And since oxygen is about 21% of air, its individual contribution, its partial pressure PO2, is roughly 160 mmHg.
Right.
Now, when that oxygen gets into our lungs, it needs to dissolve into our blood. And that's where Henry's law comes in.
Yes, Henry's law, solubility.
Exactly. It states that the amount of the gas that dissolves in a liquid is directly proportional to its partial pressure above that liquid and also its solubility coefficient in that liquid.
So the higher the pressure of oxygen we breathe.
The more of it can physically dissolve in our blood plasma, yes.
Okay.
What's interesting, though, is that carbon dioxide is actually much more soluble in blood than oxygen. About 20 times more soluble, in fact.
Oh, yeah, really?
Yeah. Oxygen's solubility coefficient in blood at body temperature is only about 0.024 milliliters of O2 per milliliter of blood per atmosphere of partial pressure.
So not very soluble normally.
Not at all. The crucial takeaway here is that under normal conditions, very, very little oxygen is just dissolved in our blood. Most of it hitches a ride on hemoglobin, but HBO, it flips that script.
Got it. Pressure forces more oxygen directly into the liquid part of our blood. What other physical laws are relevant here?
We should probably briefly mention Boyle's law.
Pressure and volume.
Right. If the temperature stays constant, the volume of a gas shrinks as the pressure increases. This matters for any gas-filled cavities in the body when you go into a hyperbaric chamber. Think sinuses, middle ear.
Like squeezing a balloon?
Exactly. Higher pressure, smaller volume. Also, as the overall barometric pressure rises in the chamber, the air itself becomes denser.
Denser air.
Yeah. Now, this might not be noticeable at rest for most healthy people within the typical HBO range, say 1.5 to 2.5 times normal atmospheric pressure, or ATA.
Okay.
But it could potentially make breathing a bit harder during exertion, especially for someone who already has some kind of respiratory limitation.
Makes sense. More effort to move denser air.
Precisely. And just to round things out, there's Charles's law, which connects the pressure and temperature of a gas when the volume is kept constant. Less directly relevant here, but part of the gas law family.
Okay. So the physics sets the stage. Pressure is the key driver, forcing more oxygen into our blood, and increased overall pressure has these other effects on gas behavior in the body. Now, before we dig into how HBO changes things, let's quickly remind ourselves, how does oxygen normally get from the air we breathe to, the tiny mitochondria inside our cells? What's that standard route?
Think of it as the oxygen pathway. It's quite a journey.
Okay.
It starts with the ambient air you inhale. That air travels down to the alveoli in your lungs, those millions of tiny air sacs where the magic happens.
Gas exchange.
Right. Oxygen moves across that super thin membrane into the pulmonary capillaries and latches onto hemoglobin in your red blood cells.
Got it.
Then that oxygen-rich blood travels back to the heart, gets pumped out into the main circulation, and flows out to capillaries all over your body.
To the tissues.
Exactly. From there, oxygen detaches from hemoglobin, dissolves into the surrounding plasma, diffuses across the capillary walls into the fluid, bathing the cells, the interstitial fluid,
Almost there.
and finally enters the cells themselves, making its way to the mitochondria. Those are the powerhouses where it's actually used.
Okay, we know the highway. Now, let's break down the key steps in getting oxygen from outside air to tissues under, well, normal everyday conditions.
Right. Several phases involved. First up is ventilation, just the act of breathing.
In and out.
Yep. At rest, we breathe maybe 12 to 15 times a minute, moving about 6 to 8 liters of air. In the alveoli, this fresh air mixes with the air already there, and oxygen diffuses into the blood while carbon dioxide moves out.
The exchange.
On average, we take in about 250 milliliters of oxygen per minute and get rid of roughly 200 milliliters of carbon dioxide. During exercise, of course, breathing rate and depth ramp up hugely to keep those alveolar oxygen levels steady. Normally, the partial pressure of oxygen there is around 104 mmHg.
And then comes the transport phase, getting that oxygen from the lungs out to the body. That's where hemoglobin is the star player, right?
Absolutely the star, normally. About 97% of the oxygen transported from lungs to tissues binds to hemoglobin inside red blood cells.
Only 97%. What about the rest?
Only a tiny fraction, about 3%, dissolves directly in the plasma under normal conditions. That's key.
Okay.
Each gram of hemoglobin can bind roughly 1.34 milliliter of oxygen. With a typical hemoglobin level of, say, 15 grams per 100 milliliter of blood, fully saturated blood can carry around 20 milliliters of oxygen.
But it's usually not fully saturated.
Right. Usually it's about 97.5% saturated leaving the lungs, so carrying maybe 19.5 milliliter per 100 milliliter of blood. Then, as this blood flows through tissue capillaries, about 5 milliliter of that oxygen gets extracted by the tissues at rest.
And more during exercise.
Oh yeah, much more. During really intense exercise, when oxygen demand skyrockets, that extraction can jump up to around 15 milliliters per 100 milliliter of blood. It's a remarkable system, really, how it can increase oxygen delivery so dramatically, up to 20-fold sometimes.
We often hear about the oxygen-hemoglobin dissociation curve. What's the main thing we need to grasp about that?
That curve basically shows how willing hemoglobin is to let go of its oxygen at different oxygen pressures. It has that characteristic S shape.
Right, the sigmoid curve.
Exactly. It reflects how oxygen binding to one part of the hemoglobin molecule makes it easier for the next oxygen molecule to bind that's cooperative binding. The P50 value, which is around 26.3 millHg in adults, tells you the oxygen pressure at which hemoglobin is 50% saturated.
And things can shift this curve.
Oh, yes. Factors like pH, CO2 levels, temperature, they can shift it left or right. A shift to the right means hemoglobin releases oxygen more easily, good for active tissues.
Like in exercise.
Right. A shift to the left means it holds on to oxygen more tightly, potentially helpful for picking up oxygen in the lungs if breathing is difficult. But, and this is important for HBO,
Yes.
under the really high oxygen pressures of HBO, the amount of dissolved oxygen becomes so significant that these finer points of hemoglobin saturation become, well, less of a limiting factor for getting oxygen into the tissues. The dissolved fraction takes on a much bigger role.
I see. So from the relatively high oxygen pressure in the lungs, there's this step-by-step decrease as it makes its way to the cells. That's the oxygen cascade, isn't it?
Precisely. The partial pressure of oxygen drops progressively from ambient air, around 160 mmHg,
Okay.
down to alveolar air, maybe 104 mmHg, then arterial blood, around 95 mmHg. Then it drops further in the capillaries, the interstitial fluid, and finally, inside the mitochondria, it's only a few mmHg. Just a tiny pressure is needed there.
Wow, quite a drop.
It highlights that oxygen transfer can be bottlenecked at any point along this pathway.
Ah.
And we should also quickly mention the Fick principle.
Fick. VO2 equals.
VO2 Q times Ca VO2. Basically, your total oxygen consumption, VO2, depends on your cardiac output, Q, how much blood your heart pumps, and how much oxygen your tissues extract from that blood. The arteriovenous oxygen difference, CaVO2.
Simple equation, profound implications.
Indeed. And it's worth noting the brain uses a disproportionately large amount of oxygen relative to its size. Very hungry organ.
And finally, once oxygen gets inside the cell, what's its main job?
Its primary role is in the mitochondria, the cell's power plants. It's the final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain.
The key step in making ATP.
Exactly. The crucial part of aerobic respiration that generates the vast majority of our cellular energy currency, ATP. Interestingly, you only need a very low partial pressure of oxygen inside the cell for this. Just 1 to 3 mmHg is usually enough.
So low.
Yep. Under normal conditions, how quickly our cells use oxygen is mainly driven by their energy demand, basically.
Yeah.
How much ADP, the precursor to ATP, is available.
Not usually limited by oxygen supply itself.
Not typically in healthy tissue at rest. Oh, and one more cool thing. The Haldane effect.
What's that?
It describes how when oxygen binds to hemoglobin, it actually reduces hemoglobin's ability to carry carbon dioxide. This helps push CO2 off the hemoglobin in the lungs so we can breathe it out. It aids CO2 transport.
Fascinating interplay. Okay, that's our healthy baseline. Now let's get to the main event. How does hyperbaric oxygenation shake things up? We mentioned pressure units earlier. Remind us of the key ones for HBO.
Sure. You'll often see pressure in millimeters of mercury.
Yeah.
mmHg, the classic unit. But really important for HBO is atmosphere's absolute, or ATA. 1 ATA is just normal atmospheric pressure at sea level.
About 760 millimilHg.
Exactly. Or about 101 kilopascals kPa. Sometimes you might see psi, pounds per square inch, but a TA is standard in the HBO world. And we always mean absolute pressure, the total pressure you experience, including the normal 1 ATA plus whatever's added in the chamber.
You're not just the pressure added.
Correct. That would be gauge pressure. We use absolute. So 2 ATA means twice the normal sea level pressure.
Okay. And the big fundamental change with HBO is it dramatically increases how much oxygen dissolves in our blood plasma.
That is the central point. Normally, very little oxygen dissolves because it's not very soluble and the pressure isn't that high.
Yeah.
But bring the 100% oxygen at, say, 2 or 3 ATA.
Henry's law kicks in.
Kicks in big time.
Right.
The partial pressure of oxygen in your alveoli skyrockets, and boom, the amount of oxygen that physically dissolves in the plasma increases dramatically. Our source highlights that at 3 ATA breathing 100% oxygen, you can get up to 6 volume percent of oxygen dissolved in plasma.
6 volume percent. How does that compare to normal?
Well, normally dissolved oxygen is maybe a 0.3 volume percent. And the total oxygen carried by hemoglobin is around 20 volume percent. So 6 volume percent dissolved is huge.
Wow.
It's potentially enough, the source notes, to meet the body's basic resting oxygen needs, even if hemoglobin wasn't carrying any oxygen.
That's incredible. The plasma alone could potentially keep tissues supplied.
Think about that, yeah. Your blood plasma becomes a major oxygen transporter. That's a fundamental shift from how our bodies normally operate, and the PO2 in the blood just rises almost linearly with the pressure increase.
So the liquid part of our blood becomes this super oxygenated fluid. How does that change things when the blood reaches the capillaries and needs to deliver oxygen to tissues?
Okay, so let's say the tissues still extract the same amount of oxygen, maybe 5 volume percent. Under normal conditions, the pressure drops from maybe 100 millimHg in the artery to 40 millimHg in the vein to deliver that amount.
Right, a 60 millimilHg drop.
But under HBO, say at 3 ATA, your starting arterial PO2 might be closer to 2000 millimHg. So to deliver that same 5 volume percent of oxygen, the pressure drop might be much, much larger. Maybe the venous PO2 ends up around 1900 millimHg or even higher. The cells still get the oxygen molecules they need, but the pressure gradient driving diffusion from the capillary into the tissue is massively increased.
Okay, that makes sense. Higher driving pressure. Now, I read something about HBO possibly affecting CO2 levels slightly. What's going on there?
Right, this relates back to hemoglobin and the Haldane effect, actually. When venous blood becomes nearly 100% saturated with oxygen under HBO, there's less room on the hemoglobin molecule for CO2 to bind for its trip back to the lungs.
Because oxygen is taking up all the seats?
Kind of, yeah. Remember, hemoglobin normally helps carry about 20% of the CO2. So if more hemoglobin is bound to oxygen, its CO2 carrying capacity is slightly reduced.
So CO2 might build up a bit.
It can lead to a slight increase in the partial pressure of CO2 in the blood, the PCO2, and maybe a tiny decrease in blood pH, making it a tad more acidic. But usually it's not a major problem if blood flow stays constant because other CO2 transport mechanisms dissolve CO2 and bicarbonate ions handle the load. It's generally a small effect.
Got it. What about the actual oxygen levels, the PO2, within the tissues themselves during HBO? What determines that?
Well, it's a combination of factors. Obviously, the super high arterial PO2 is the starting point. Then there's the increased total oxygen content in the blood. But also crucial are the rate of blood flow to that specific tissue and how much oxygen that tissue is actively using.
So flow and consumption matter too.
Absolutely. Our source mentions that the difference in oxygen pressure between arteries and veins, the AV difference, can widen significantly under HBO. For instance, breathing 100% O2 at 3 ATA, it could be up to 350 millimilHg.
Okay. But you also mentioned HBO causes vasoconstriction. Doesn't that reduce blood flow?
It does, yes. HBO tends to cause blood vessels to narrow, which reduces blood flow to many tissues. That sounds bad. Less flow.
It sounds paradoxical, right? Reduced flow, but better oxygenation. But the thing is, the arterial PO2 is so high under HBO that even with reduced flow, the sheer amount of oxygen dissolved in the plasma can often more than compensate, ensuring cells still get plenty of oxygen.
So the increased driving pressure overcomes the reduced flow.
Exactly. And some researchers think this vasoconstriction might actually be a protective mechanism in healthy tissues, preventing them from being flooded with too much oxygen, potentially reducing oxidative stress. Interestingly, this vasoconstrictor response might be weaker or even absent in tissues that are already hypoxic or oxygen-starved.
Which could be helpful therapeutically.
Potentially, yes. Drive more oxygen specifically to the areas that need it most. And human studies do confirm that HBO exposure often leads to a decrease in heart rate bradycardia and a drop in cardiac output.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit. What are some of the broader systemic effects of HBO on a healthy person? Our source mentioned a table. All right, table 2.5 gives a nice overview. For oxygen transport and metabolism, as we've said, the high dissolved O2 means hemoglobin's usual role in both O2 and CO2 transport is somewhat altered. It also mentions the biological burning of normal oxygen metabolism.
Which hints at?
Potential for increased reactive oxygen species, oxidative stress. We'll definitely circle back to that when we talk biochemical effects more specifically.
Okay. And the respiratory system. Breathing, lungs.
HBO can suppress the activity of the carotid and aortic bodies. These are key sensors monitoring blood gases.
Chemoreceptors.
Exactly. Suppressing them can lead to a decrease in breathing rate and depth-deprived ventilation. Also, when you breathe 100% oxygen, the nitrogen that normally keeps the tiny air sacs open gets washed out.
Nitrogen washout.
Right. Theoretically, this could make areas of the lung more prone to collapse, especially if there's any blockage. Though the clinical significance in healthy folks at typical HBO pressures seems minimal.
We touched on the cardiovascular system, vasoconstriction, lower heart rate, potentially lower cardiac output. Anything else there?
Yeah, the source notes that while cardiac output often drops because of the slower heart rate, overall blood pressure in humans usually doesn't change much.
Interesting.
And importantly, even with reduced blood flow to organs due to vasoconstriction, organ function isn't typically impaired. Why? Because the massively increased arterial PO2 compensates, ensuring adequate oxygen delivery.
So the oxygen pressure saves the day despite lower flow.
Pretty much.
Wow.
Regarding peripheral vessels, yeah, we see vasoconstriction in places like the brain, kidneys, eyes, leading to higher overall peripheral resistance. An interesting point about skin blood flow. It decreases with hyperoxia, but maybe not so much near chronic wounds, and the response can return as the wound heals.
Okay, those are some body-wide effects. Let's zoom back into the smallest vessels, the microcirculation. What happens there?
HBO seems to have some positive effects here. It's been shown to improve the flexibility or elasticity of red blood cells.
Make them more bendy.
Essentially, yeah, which helps them squeeze through narrow or compromised capillaries. It also seems to reduce the tendency of platelets to stick together, platelet aggregation.
Which could reduce clots.
Potentially, yes. Both affect more flexible red cells. Less sticky platelets could help improve oxygen delivery in tissues with poor circulation where things might otherwise get clogged up. And again, that extra dissolved oxygen can diffuse further, reaching areas red cells might struggle to get to.
Okay, let's revisit the respiratory system quickly. You mentioned some more details.
Right. So beyond just generally depressing ventilation, HBO can also reversibly dampen our body's normal drive to breathe more when oxygen levels get low, the hypoxic ventilatory drive.
Affects the low oxygen alarm.
Seems like it, likely via those carotid chemoreceptors again. Interestingly, standard lung function tests, like how much air you can blow out fast, FEC, FEV1, usually aren't significantly changed by HBO in healthy people.
So lung capacity stays pretty much the same.
Largely, yes. Although some studies looking at repeated daily HBO sessions over time reported small decreases in some measures of airflow, like mean expiratory flow. But usually these didn't cause any symptoms in the healthy subjects.
Okay, now let's get into the really nitty-gritty. The biochemical effects. What's happening at the molecular level?
This is where things get really complex and interesting. Researchers are looking for biomarkers, ways to measure HBO's effects. One example mentioned is urine methylguanidine. Levels seem to go up, possibly reflecting increased production of reactive oxygen species.
Like a marker for oxidative activity.
Potentially, yeah. And MRI is becoming a powerful tool, too. Not just standard MRI, but specialized techniques like dynamic T1 and T2-weighted imaging can actually help visualize and track changes in tissue and blood oxygenation in real time. especially in the brain.
Seeing HBO in action, what about our body's acid-base balance? Does all that extra oxygen mess with pH?
Well, because hemoglobin is so saturated with oxygen, it's slightly less effective at buffering the blood against the acid produced from CO2 transport. So you can get a tiny bit of CO2 retention and a slight increase in hydrogen ions, making things a touch more acidic.
Right.
But on the flip side, HBO is known to reduce the buildup of lactic acid in hypoxic tissues or during heavy exercise. Lactic acid is, well, an acid. So HBO can actually help counteract acidosis in those situations.
So it's a bit of a mixed effect depending on the context.
Exactly. It depends on the overall metabolic state.
Our source also mentions specific effects on enzymes. What's happening there?
Yeah, a whole range of effects. For instance, it can inactivate an enzyme called cyclooxygenase, which is involved in making prostacyclin, a substance that normally dilates blood vessels and stops platelets clumping.
So inhibiting that might contribute to vasoconstriction.
Plausibly. Conversely, HBO can induce or stimulate the production of another enzyme, hemoxygenase 1, HO1. HO1 is actually seen as protective against oxidative stress and DNA damage.
So a protective response, perhaps.
Could be. It also inhibits some enzymes involved in making neurotransmitters, like phenylalanine and tyrosine hydroxylase. And interestingly, it activates key mitochondrial enzymes involved in energy production, like succinic dehydrogenase, SDH, and cytochrome C oxidase, CCO.
The power plant enzymes.
Right. And in some post-surgical situations, like after bowel surgery, HBO has been shown to help normalize the levels of these enzymes.
So again, a real mixed bag of enzyme effects. And what about the big question of oxidative stress? Does flooding the body with oxygen cause damaging free radicals?
That's the million-dollar question, and the answer seems to be, it's complicated.
Huh, isn't it always?
Pretty much. While the potential for increased free radical production is definitely there, you're providing more substrate. After all, some studies suggest HBO might simultaneously boost the body's own antioxidant defenses.
Like the HO1 induction you mentioned.
Exactly. The body might ramp up its protective mechanisms in response. We also see an increase in nitric oxide, NO synthesis, which has complex roles but can act as an antioxidant too. Animal studies hint that actually getting oxygen to the tissues and letting cellular defenses work might be more effective against chronic oxidative stress than just taking antioxidant pills.
Interesting. Okay, let's shift to the nervous system. What does HBO do to the brain?
Well, we already talked about the vasoconstriction and reduced cerebral blood flow. At typical therapeutic pressures, say 1.5 to 2.5 ATA, this is generally well tolerated in healthy adults. No obvious problems.
But at higher pressures?
At much higher pressures or longer exposures, you run the risk of central nervous system oxygen toxicity. That can lead to neurological symptoms, even convulsions. That's a major limiting factor for using very high pressures.
Right. But in cases of brain injury?
Then it can be beneficial. If the brain is ischemic or hypoxic starved of oxygen, HBO can help reduce swelling, cerebral edema, and improve the function of struggling neurons. You can sometimes see this reflected as improvements in brain electrical activity, like on an EEG.
And what about brain energy use? Brain metabolism?
A lot of research here has focused on understanding that oxygen toxicity. It seems that in the lead-up to convulsions at high pressure, there are shifts in brain electrical activity, blood flow, oxygen levels, and metabolic rate.
Changes before the seizure.
Yeah. Rat studies at 3 ATA, for example, showed increased glucose use in certain brain areas before toxicity signs appeared. HBO can also affect things like the glycerophosphate shuttle, a pathway involved in energy transfer within brain cells.
Complex metabolic shifts. It even affects how the brain handles ammonia.
Apparently so.
Oh.
Ammonia can build up after brain injury and be toxic.
Yeah.
Studies in animals suggest HBO at 3 ATA might help prevent this ammonia buildup. Several proposed ways. Stimulating glutamate formation, which binds ammonia to make harmless glutamine, reducing the activity of glutaminase, an enzyme that makes ammonia, and promoting the removal of ammonia from the brain as glutamine. Pretty specific effects.
Very specific. Okay, finally, let's go right down to the molecular core, our DNA. What's the impact there?
Research indicates that a therapeutic HBO session can cause some temporary DNA damage, particularly in white blood cells, leukocytes.
Damage? That sounds bad.
It does, but the key word is temporary. This damage is usually repaired quite quickly, often within 24 hours. And interestingly, the effect often seems less pronounced after subsequent HBO treatments.
Like the cells adapt.
That's the theory that the body ramps up its antioxidant defenses and DNA repair mechanisms in response. Some studies also suggest that how the pressure is increased matters. A slower, more gradual compression phase might minimize even that temporary damage.
So the body's repair systems can handle it.
It appears so, for the typical DNA strand breaks and base modifications seen with therapeutic HBO. They seem to be rapidly repaired.
Okay. So, after wading through all these effects, physical, physiological, biochemical, molecular, and brain, what's the main takeaway from our source about HBO's impact on a healthy human body?
The source really emphasizes that while HBO clearly triggers this wide spectrum of changes, the actual practical significance of many of these effects in healthy individuals still needs more research. We see the changes, but what do they really mean long-term or functionally?
Lots still to learn.
Definitely. And it stresses that studies using super high pressures, like 6 ATA, mainly to study toxicity, aren't directly comparable to clinical therapy, which usually stays below 2 ATA, often around 1.5 ATA, especially for things like brain injury.
Right, different ballgame.
Yeah, in fact, for brain injury, pushing much above 1.5 ATA might even be counterproductive sometimes. But the general consensus seems to be that HBO at 1.5 to 2 ATA, for exposures up to maybe 40 to 60 minutes, is generally safe and well tolerated in healthy people.
Okay, so wrapping this up. This deep dive really shows that hyperbaric oxygenation is way more than just breathing extra oxygen. That added pressure is the key. It fundamentally changes the physics of gas in our bodies.
Absolutely. It leads to this whole cascade of effects. Massively increased dissolved oxygen, which then impacts cardiovascular function, breathing, brain activity, metabolism, enzymes, even down to our DNA.
It's a profound physiological intervention.
It really is. And while it appears generally safe at the usual therapeutic ranges for healthy folks, it clearly induces significant changes. These are still being actively researched, especially for all the potential therapeutic uses, which, as our source hinted, is a whole other fascinating conversation.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? Oxygen is so fundamental to life. The idea that just by changing its pressure, we can unlock such different physiological states. Well, it makes you wonder what other surprising aspects of our biology we might uncover and what new treatments might emerge down the road.
It certainly highlights the delicate balance within our bodies and how profoundly external factors like pressure can influence those intricate internal systems. A lot left to explore.